interview with Bo Brown, one of the Missouri Folk Arts Program's 2025 Living Tradition Sustainer Fellows. The date is December 9th, 2025, and my name is Kaitlyn McConnell, and today I'm visiting with Bo at his home near Rogersville, Missouri. So thank you for letting me come visit with you.
Welcome.
Obviously we're going to kind of cover a lot of things with the conversation, but can we start out talking about what is foraging and kind of how you got into this for someone who might not fully understand what that concept is?
Yeah. Foraging is just the act of going out into the wild and collecting plants, mushrooms, fruits, nuts, whatever's out there, take it home. I mean, you can eat them on the spot for survival, or you can take it home and make fabulous goodies with them, which is what I've kind of gotten into lately. So it's just picking wild food. It's deep in our culture here because poverty. Mm-hmm. A lot of that, like the Appalachian and other areas where there's a lot of rural poverty, the people did that. That's where I was introduced to it. My mom, she grew up in Arkansas, was born in the cotton country over in eastern Arkansas, and then during the Depression, that work gave out. They were cotton pickers, and anyway, whenever that gave out, they left there and went to around Yellville, Arkansas, and got a little subsistence farm there, trying to raise hogs and grow a garden and raise chickens and whatever. And they said the ground was so rough, there was, you could hardly even grow anything, so they had to do this. So my earliest memories, I was raised right down the road here at McCraw Ford. That was our closest good fishing spot. I grew up in Stratford. And so I was literally raised on the riverbank, and every time we'd go fishing, if the watercress is out, we'd stop by the spring at Danforth Cemetery, Pearson Creek Spring, where it comes out of the ground. There's always water. To this day, I still get watercress there. Wow. And we saw poke greens or lamb's quarters, cur the dock, where she had about a half a dozen plants that she looked out for, and we'd get them. And then in summertime, she'd send us neighbor kids out to go get, blackberries, whatever, fruits and pawpaws and persimmons in the fall, hickory nuts and walnuts in the fall, in the late fall. And that was our winter work, cracking nuts, and didn't have TV until I was about 10, and so the evening's entertainment was sitting around and listen to radio and picking nuts.
Wow. Well, and so it sounds like when you were growing up, I mean, this wasn't a novelty as for your family. Were you still relying on this as like a food source?
It was a food source. She always grew a big garden and canned and put up food, since putting food by, or what are a lot of names for it, but she did that. And then like I said, everything in season, it all went into the pot. Whenever I was old enough to get my first gun, there were a lot of weeks that if we had meat, that was because I was the one that had the time to go out and hunt rabbits or squirrels or quail or whatever, and that went into the pot. But I remember there were weeks on end we'd be eating pinto beans and ham hock if we were lucky, and if we had meat, it's because I'd come home from school and have a couple 3 hours for dinner to go out and get something. So it was a useful tool. I didn't think it was fun or exotic. It was just life, just what people did. And a lot of the other kids around us did the same thing.
Well, and just to kind of set the timeline too, what years are we talking about when you were growing up?
Well, I was born in 53.
Okay.
And so by 57, 58, that's probably some of my earliest memories that I can remember, growing up there and being in, going to the river and stuff, probably 5, 6 years old, and but all through that, it was an interesting way to grow up, and looking back on it, because usually, I mean, most everybody, you get up into your 75 and 80-year-olds, they all had that experience, no running water and no indoor toilets and all that kind of stuff. But there was just this little, I don't know if you remember the old Dutch's Tavern off of it's Double O. It used to be Route 66. It's about a little ways between Springfield and Stratford. And we lived in a little group of houses along there. And anyway, it was just a lot of them were in the same boat. They were built in the 40s, I think, for returning servicemen to have a place to live. And our house was a concrete floor, cinder block walls, tiny little place. I mean, it's 3 rooms with a wooden back porch and everything. So had a big old pump out in the back to pump water. And that was, I think I was around 8 or 9 when Dad decided to build onto the place, and we finally got indoor plumbing. And then got a TV whenever I was 10. And yeah, so it was, a little rustic compared to most people's experiences.
Well, and so were you going to school at Stratford?
Yes.
Okay. And
graduated in 71.
Okay.
Barely.
Well, and so what did you do after that?
Right out of school. Oh man. A lot of this is probably not fit for public consumption, but anyway, right out of school, my dad thought, because he was like a electronics repairman, he could do that stuff. He's mainly he worked at Sandy's service station at the corner of St. Louis and Glenstone for 24, 25 years, something like that. And so he was real handy with doing mechanic stuff. He taught me all that. But he thought that he wanted me to do better than he did, so he paid for me to go to electronics school in North Kansas City right out of high school because I could solder. And then I didn't. That was why I shouldn't have graduated, is because of the math thing. It was just another language. All the letters they put behind kids' names now, the ADD, the ADHD, ACDC, whatever they are. I had them all. I mean, it was all, they didn't have names for it, but they, looking back on it, I couldn't pay attention. I had 2 or 3 teachers tell me I'd never amount to anything because I wouldn't pay attention. And so he put me in electronics school in North Kansas City, and it's all math. I bombed terribly. It was awful. And then I took off. I was dating a gal there, and her parents sent her to Denver for the summer to get her away from me, pretty much. And so I took off and lived in my van, living in the streets up there right out of high school. And yeah, it was the typical hippie experience, but came back and then started. The only jobs I could get were manual labor, temporary labor jobs. Just had one really crappy job after another, and I think the last one I had of those was Green Lawn Chemical, and they ended in a screaming fight with lots of curse words and everything. I just didn't like getting yelled at, and so at that point I just said, I'm going to play music for a living or starve to death. And so that's what I did, and I did both real good for a long time.
Well, and that was one thing I wanted to integrate into the conversation too, is the music part. And so was that something you learned growing up as well?
Yeah, my mom sang to me from the earliest memories. Again, when she was driving, she could yodel like nobody's business. She loved the old Sons of the Pioneers, that kind of country western yodeling. And we grew up, our Saturday night entertainment was tuning in the radio to the Clear Channel 650, the Grand Ole Opry, and I knew all those names by heart, and so that was my introduction to it. Then when I was about, probably 9 or 10, my sister, who was still at home at the time, had gotten into folk music and songwriting and stuff, and she taught me guitar. So that was kind of my introduction into music. And I just messed around with it, didn't do much with it for a couple of years. And then somewhere around, I guess around age 14, late 60s somewhere, one of the kids at Stratford took me over to his house and introduced me to electric guitar, rock and roll. I was like, whoa! It was like, that's all I did. First couple of bands were just god awful terrible. We did the easiest things you could possibly do, and barely know how to play guitar, like Louie Louie and some old Ventures songs. And then when the heavy rock started coming out, like Black Sabbath, I wanted to be Black Sabbath. I think our first rock band was Rock Earth, and so I did that for a while, and it just, I wasn't cool enough, didn't have the clothes, and it was a game of who could look the coolest, act the coolest on stage, and all that kind of stuff. And I just didn't give a whack about any of that stuff. And so after a while, I floated into other things. I played funk for a while, played country for a while, trying to make some money, and blues. Got into, went through all those things. And I think 1975, a buddy of mine drugged me to the Winfield Bluegrass Festival, the Walnut Valley Festival in Winfield, Kansas. And I didn't even want to go. I said, man, they play banjos and stuff there. I don't want that. He said, yeah, but there's women at the gazoos. So that's what he talked me into going, and it just spun my head around so bad. See, I saw the flat picking championship, and that was the year Mark O'Connor won it, and that just floored me how these guys are picking out these intricate, melodies, and the other thing is I had hair down to about here at the time. And the older generation around here, they'd spit at you. I mean, it was just, you represented something they hated. They didn't know why, but the whole smoking weed, long hair, and just all that stuff. And I got nothing but grief from that generation around here. And then I get out here, and there's these same people on overalls, cowboy hats, sitting around picking. And you walk up with a guitar and, sound like you know a little bit. Hey, come on in here, sit down and pick. And it was just like all of that disappeared. It was like, that was the most welcoming place that you can imagine for somebody, that looked like me and people that looked like them. And it was like, it was the music, that was that really what knocked me out about that. It wasn't about, how cool you looked or how old you were or young you were or anything like that. It was just like, let's just make some music here. Some of it was good, some of it was real good, some of it was real bad. But that's what kind of hooked me in, and so I think around 76 or 77, I got my first job playing all summer at Silver Dollar City. It was a 3-piece band. The Arkemo Rangers. Okay. Now there was a different younger Arkemo Rangers that came about that ended up kind of turning into the Hillbenders. Okay. And I thought they had stolen our band name because the one of the guys, Dave Harp, that was in the later version of the Arkemo Rangers, when he told me his name and his band name, I said, you heard me talking about our old band at Silver Dollar City and you stole our name. He said, no, my dad played in that band. And I said, no way. I said, I was in that band, and I never heard of it. I guess his dad's name was Ron. And then I talked to the other guy, Chip Ballard, who was the singer in that band, and I was telling him about this young upstart that had stolen our band name, and he said, well, as a matter of fact, Ron was in the band before you, but when we got the Silver Dollar City gig, he said he had a steady job at the Associated Grocery and couldn't play there or something like that. And, so that's when we got you. So he really did. But at Silver Dollar City, the D.A. Calloway, just because we were the kind of kids we were, at about the second or third week of being out there, he renamed us the Delirious Brothers. Well, there's another band there, the Greer Brothers, and they did this whole joke a minute. They're still online. They're still on Facebook, and they're still funny as heck. But anyway, they were playing there, and they did just do these horrible bad jokes, and but they were the Dubious Brothers. So you had the Dubious Brothers and the Delirious Brothers. A lot of times playing one after another, so it was kind of funny. But anyway, a couple of years after that, I'd been picking with a guy named Dale Hopkins, a fiddle player around here. He was big in the contest circuit, playing. Every little town had, their town celebration usually featured a fiddle contest. So all these fiddlers, a whole bunch of them from Nevada and Nevada area, Dean Gary Johnson, let's see, Randy Newman, who's still out there playing. Oh gosh, Kelly, I can't even remember them all now. But there was all the same guys that would go to these different towns and compete, and they had it down to a science. They would find out who the judges were, and it was like, well, if he's judging, don't play Blackberry Blossom because he hates that song. He'll give you a bad number if you just even for playing that. They had it down to a science, and so I was doing that with Dale and making a good bit of money because he's winning quite a few of them. And somewhere along there, I met John Kendrick from Nevada, I think he was living in Springfield at the time. So we started playing together, and John had the most unusual banjo style I'd ever, heard anything like it. It's kind of like what Bela Fleck does now, but still different, way different. And if you've heard any of the old Undergrass Boys recordings, the live stuff, we didn't do so much of it on the album, but the live stuff, it's just, like I said, it's chromatic. It's the way you would play a saxophone or something, but done on the banjo. And anyway, so we started playing together, and eventually John and I had the idea, well, let's put a band together. Dale was off touring with, he toured with George Jones, a bunch of other people that, he ended up kind of getting up pretty close to the big time there for a while. And so anyway, we started playing together and pulled Dave Wilson and George Horn into it, and Rick Davidson. I think Rick was one of the first ones, and then George, or maybe the other order. But anyway, we played probably a few, I don't know how many shows. Each show was played under a different name. And I don't even know where it came from, but somebody said, well, you guys are playing underground bluegrass. Because we take, old rock tunes done bluegrass style and then jam them out for 20 minutes and, go from bluegrass into funk or reggae or, just kind of play with a lot of improvisational stuff with the music. And anyway, that band ended up touring all over the Midwest. We did college tours for a couple of years, toured with Emmylou Harris, Leon Russell, Juice Newton, a whole bunch of country music stars, as opening acts. And so it was just a really fun time. We played so much. I can't even remember half the places we played in those tours. It just like one after another night after another. Every night was a different place. And but it eventually, that kind of life just wears on you. And the band, first I think Dave was the first one to leave because he wanted to get off the road. And he had a new wife, wanted to stay home and raise babies. And then John, his mom got sick in Nevada. He had to get off the road and go stay with her and help her. And then I think George ended up wanting to play another season at Silver Dollar City, and the rest of them didn't want to do that. So it came down to me and Rick Davidson were the only original members. It just never had the fire it did. And so we broke up in somewhere around fall of '83, I think. And the whole year of '84, I was just lost. I didn't have anything. I'd saved up a bunch of money from touring, and that's when I was living in this little farmhouse about 1 mile and 2/3 from here. And I was really getting into the wilderness survival stuff. And it's, when I first started at Silver Dollar City, I met a Native American man, Jim Fire Eagle. And he was there chipping airheads for their crafts festival. And anyway, I just flipped out about the knowledge he had and just his plant knowledge. I mean, a lot of people knew that he was a medicine man and would go and ask him about plants, and there wasn't a plant you could show him he couldn't tell you something about. So anyway, that Don Brink and I had been, we'd played in the band together earlier, and we're doing a lot of backpacking, so our backpacking trips started getting more into that stuff and the wilderness survival. And so we're doing that from, like I said, late 70s up through '84. And so the whole summer of '84, I just did that. I was I had 20 acres of land up there. Had the river close by, and I'd have weeks worth of time where I'd have every meal was forage, squirrel, fish, whatever. I was hunting and fishing and just doing all that kind of stuff. Then
in that time, obviously today with apps and Google and your books and all the resources that are available, I could see how somebody would have a way to find the basis of a foundation. How did you do that? I mean, were there other people teaching you actively, or did you just...
Not really. There's field guides.
Okay.
Yeah, so every time we'd find a field guide of any kind, wildflowers. I mean, there weren't many foraging guides. In fact, the lack of... there was the Yule Gibbons books out, and I think Bradford Angier had some, but they were very broad. They didn't cover, it'd be plants of the West or something like that. It just didn't cover a lot here. So a lot of it was just experimentation, figuring out, what it was. And and reading about it. And I tell everybody that's whenever I'm trying to get them to buy my books to get started in learning plants, just keep field guides or foraging guides or whatever laying around wherever you know you're going to sit. I've got, there's one right up there I just got in the mail, and I've got them on my little stand next to the TV, got them on my bedstand. Of course, always put them in the turret. You're always going to be sitting down there sooner or later. And just crack it open, read about a plant. You got about enough time to read a plant or two. And, but by doing it, and then anytime we were out traveling, doing a lot of times we do backpacking trips out west, and anywhere that a ranger was doing a wildflower hike, nobody was doing foraging walks at that time. Everybody was doing wildflower walks, but so that was just another way to learn the plants. Well, once you learn the plant's name, you can look it up and find out what the whole rest of the world knows about it. So,
do you think that there was less talk of that because it was still more common to have some of that foundational knowledge when you were growing up, or do you think people just had no interest and it was?
I think it was just no interest because we ended up. Don Brink and I started the Wilderness Survival School. The first one was Red Willow Primitive Skills. We would teach friction fire, stone tools, cordage, string rope out of plant fiber, deadfall traps, shelter, and finding and treating water in a 2-day class. And so not long after that, we started breaking out and trying to do just individual foraging classes and just see if it'd work. And it just didn't get much interest. I think it was the general public didn't know enough about it, and it didn't sound like, why would I eat weeds? That stuff can't be any good. If you can't buy it in the store, how good could it be, And it's just, boy, how wrong is that? It's just entire flavor palettes that you can't buy in the store, and chefs are really getting big into it now. But so anyway, that's kind of where the foraging and all that stuff, we started doing it from meat and fire eagle. Everything I'm doing in my life other than music, I owe pretty much to backpacking with Don Brink and then getting that shot in the arm of inspiration from his tribal knowledge.
Well, you said this was around 84 was when that started?
It started probably before we met Fire Eagle. We were backpacking in the mid-70s and kind of gear-oriented and strapping on 45 pounds and grinding it out to get to a place and just kind of looking for a way to leave more stuff at home and just having that idea. And then meeting Fire Eagle, that was just, it opened that whole world up to us. And but yeah, that was ongoing long before 84. 84 was just the first year that I didn't have a job, I didn't have a band, I was so burned out from the whole music scene. I didn't know, what I was going to do basically, and I was just kind of looking for something, and then magically in the spring of '85, Jane Fitzgerald called me looking for. She was working on a bird study. She was working on her PhD in Arkansas. It was a study of the periodical cicada, of how the birds react to that 13-year emergence. And that one we had last year, that brood 19 emerged. That was the same brood, but the 1985 emergence.
Oh, wow.
And anyway, she was looking for students to work on it. She knew I knew some of the wildlife students at MSU, SMS back in the day. And so they were all out doing their summer work already. And I said, well, I'd love to do that. And she said, well, you need coursework and you need banding experience. They're looking for a bird bander. And I said, well, Kathy Sandell, a friend of ours, did some recreational banding at her place not too far from here. Helped her for a couple of weeks doing that. So I've had my hands on birds. I've done it, and I know birds pretty well. It just kind of. She said, "Well, send in a resume, see what happens." And I did by putting my survival stuff in there. Well, that got me the job out of all these other probably way more qualified applicants because it was a 3-year study. It was a year before the emergence, the year of, and the year after. And the year before, they'd use students from the university, and they wanted morning banding and evening banding. And then once it got really hot and miserable and ticky and chiggers were real bad, and the kids would come out and do the morning banding, and then they'd bail on the afternoon and go back to their air-conditioned dorm rooms or whatever. And so when they did this second year, they said, it's a stipulation you live on this site all summer long. And there's a river crossing, so you may or may not get in and out. You're going to have to buy a canoe.
Well, is that the time that the river did rise and you were stuck there for several days? I remember you talking about that one time.
Yeah, twice.
Wow.
And it was awesome. It was, I mean, especially the first few weeks, the first about 6 weeks or so until the heat started. And then it was just like, just laying out on the riverbank in late June, July, just laying out there, just laying in sweat. Luckily, I could, get up and walk 8 feet and jump in the river if I got too hot. But, you're always tick checking and, scrubbing your skin to keep the chiggers down. And, but it's like everything else. So you have a few weeks of that, it normalizes. It's just normal. And one of the funny things is we were eating dinner somewhere, and anyway, it was after the second year, because I had 2 summers of that. I did that one in '85. Then at the end of that, the guy putting it on, Kim Smith, he just passed away a few years ago. But anyway, he called. He said, "Do you want to keep doing this stuff?" And I said, "Yeah." He called up the director of Point Reyes Bird Observatory on the California coast and said, "Hey, this guy does good work. Can you use him for your winter session?" And he said, "Yeah, have him send a resume." So I did. And but anyway, we were eating dinner one night, and I was chewing on a chicken leg and just telling stories and talking, because I've been out practically by myself the whole summer, and I just had a lot to talk about. And I was just chewing on a chicken leg and just pitched it over my shoulder. It's like bounced off the wall, and everybody said, "What is wrong with you?" I've been doing that for 2 summers in a row. You lose all those little habitual things like small talk, like going to the grocery store and trying to make small talk with somebody in the line with you, and it's like, God, I'll get all awkward and stumble over my words and feel like a dumbass and just, but, and, forget to zip up my pants, feeling crawly in Walmart and start to drop trout and go for a tick or something. And so it just all those little habitual things you don't think about, they go away pretty quick.
Well, and so from that point in the mid 80s, I mean, has it been pretty much food or survival, but has been your full-time work ever since?
Pretty much, yeah. And well, not really. There's a period from '85 till '93 that's when, after that first bird study, that's all I did. I got on that first one, the cicada project. The winter, worked at Point Reyes, came back and did the third study, which is my second year. Arkansas, and then from there it was one job after another, and so same kids that Jane was looking for to work on the cicada project, they called me when they heard that I was doing this work, and they said, "Hey, wait, this is fall of '86. I just finished up the cicada project, the second year of that," and they called up and they said, "We're working on this pesticide study in Rio Grande Valley of Texas. If you're doing that work, you want a job for the next 3 months, come on down."
Wow. And
I had 3 days to get home, unpack my stuff from camping all summer, and repack for 3 months in the Rio Grande Valley and go down there, and worked on that study, and it was just one after another. I worked in, that was the first one, and it was fall of '86. '87, I worked about a month and a half in Iowa in the spring doing grassland stuff, and then went to Colorado for the rest of the summer doing biological inventory, which we were doing birds, bugs, plants, all of it, the small mammal trapping. Then '88, I did another pesticide study. I worked 4 different pesticide studies. They were all done through Brigham Young University for EPA, and so they're avian pesticide mortality investigations. You had to sign an NDA that was like 8 pages long. That if you said anything that got to the media, they'd crucify you. And And it was it was the best money I'd ever made doing that kind of work, but also is the most heartbreaking stuff because you spend about 6 weeks doing a baseline, doing surveys to see what's there to be able to be affected. Then they do the pesticide application, then you document the birds dying. And just a lot of it was just searching for dead birds. The second one I did was in alfalfa in Oklahoma in '88, and that was I had to go Provo, Utah, for a month and a half to train with bird dogs. They trained these bird dogs to look for dead birds because you couldn't see the ground in the alfalfa. So I did that for that summer, and came back, got a band together. Every winter I'd come back and throw a band together. '89, I ended up getting on a bear study. So I worked on a black bear study in the Washitals all summer in '89. The winter of '89 and '90, I was in Belize all winter long doing the bird studies there. And that Kim Smith guy, he got me most of those jobs. He got me the bear study, he got me both studies in Belize. But I did the '89, '90 in Belize. Then in '90, I got hired for by UC Riverside to do a development study. So I was there 90, 91, and 92. Actually, the first year of '90, I only did 2.5 months in California. Then I got, because I'd applied for this job earlier in Idaho, doing a whole bunch of different stuff. But the main gig, it was the biggest dream job you could imagine. I did do bird surveys on 60 miles of the South Fork of the Snake River in southeastern Idaho, and most of it was in excess of our road, so I had to do it by boat. So you're on the Snake River on a little 14-foot fishing boat with a like a 40-horse, one of those jet outboard motors on it and stuff. And the surveys are done by 10 o'clock in the morning, 9:30, something like that. You got to start half an hour before daybreak, and they're done more or less by 9:30. And then all I'd have to do is find my next survey route, mark it so I could find it in the dark. Because by the time you get out there and to start the survey, it's still dark. And so you're out in the boat the whole day with nothing to do. What are you going to do? So I literally got tired of eating cutthroat trout, morel mushrooms, and wild asparagus. It was just, their morel season was probably 2.5 months, 2 months long there. And they were just thick. And so that was a fun gig. So it was that until I came back from that in '92. And that's when we started the Wilderness Survival School.
Okay, so at that point, where does it kind of, I don't know, diverge is the right word, but where the foraging interest comes alongside that? Like how long did that take?
From the time it's always been there, but when I was traveling, I was doing it out there, in fact, Jane Fitzgerald, I just talked with her recently. She was telling a story about they were down in some South America somewhere and saw a table full of other English speakers, sat down there, and they were talking, and they said, "Oh, where are you from?" And Jane said, "Well, I'm from around Springfield." And they said, "Oh, we met a guy from Springfield once," and this was in Colorado. It was actually the people that run the High Country News. Do you know that publication? They just made the news. They're still out there, but they're a big environmental newspaper based in Paonia, where it was one of the towns I lived in when I was working out there. But anyway, they said, "Oh yeah, we met this guy from Springfield. He was out in the yard eating weeds." She said, "Bo Brown?" I said, "Yeah, that was him." So, but anyway, that I gotta get a drink here.
What about the public interest? Like, where did that sort of start to emerge?
Well, we started school started doing classes in '93. And that was, doing all of this stuff. Foraging was just a part of that whole thing. And like I said, I was trying to do just standalone foraging classes in there, and they just weren't really that popular. I think where it really started getting big was, I don't know how long ago, probably 10 years ago or so, there started to be Facebook foraging groups. And that's where the public, because I've been doing all this stuff in my own little sphere and nobody knew it. You know, it was just, I wasn't really, you know, connected with a big social network thing at the time. The only way we could advertise there was several magazines, Wilderness Way, the Primitive Archery magazine, and there was another thing called the Bulletin for the Society of Primitive Technology. And so that's about the only target marketing you could do is in mags like that, other than putting flyers up. And then so when the internet, we at least finally got a website so people could go to. But still, before the social media, there was not an easy way for people to find that stuff, unless you search the keywords and whatever. But once the Facebook group started, then I started seeing what an audience it was and started doing more foraging walks. And a lot of people found out I was doing it and started reaching out. And then in 2018, I guess it was, Falcon Guides reached out and said, we're looking for an author for the Foraging the Ozarks book. They'd already had, all of the western states had their own state foraging book. The Rocky Mountains had one for them, had a bunch of eastern states, had one for New England, and so they're trying to get every state or bioregion their own regional foraging book. So they called me up and said, we would like you to author this if you'd like to. And I said, yeah, how did you find me? And they said, well, we looked up saw that the Ozarks was ripe for a book because the culture was there. It's steeped in that, in the culture here. And there's a lot of popularity, and they said everywhere we went, we kept seeing your name. So anyway, I wrote that book, and that's when it really blew up.
I'm sure the timing with COVID too, and people wanting to, I'm sure was crazy how that happened.
Two things about that. The book came out in July of 2020, about the time they were having all of the supply line shortages. One of the things is that I had a book tour booked up. I mean, I probably had 25 or more bookings of speaking engagements and talks and foraging walks, all kinds of stuff, just one by one. In about 4 days, I lost probably $5 or $6 grand worth of income. Just I mean, it was just like every few hours somebody call or email say, well, we're going to have to cancel this thing. And so anyway, a lot of people lost their work. They're at home. They're on the internet. They're kind of looking for stuff. And so people were finding it that way. And then, like I said, the going to the grocery store and finding the produce shelves empty. I think that really, really, drove the interest a lot to it.
Has that sustained since then, or is it?
Yeah, it's I'd say even bigger now than it was then. There's a lot more of a community aspect of it. So I started doing a lot more edible plant walks, and somewhere along there, Rachel West, Rachel, I think it was at the WOW Outdoor School at Roaring River. I've been teaching there for probably close to 20 years, teach the primitive skill stuff there. She popped into my teaching area and says, oh, you Bo Brown, I've been wanting to meet you. Here, try this black trumpet risotto. And it was like, holy cow. This is like, and anyway, we got to talking, and I've been a plant nerd ever since I've been into this stuff, and I'm really focused on I just want to know what everything is. And in fact, Sean Sherman, the sous chef, he said something that resonated with me in one of his interviews. He said, not knowing a plant's name haunts me. And so it was kind of the level I was in geekery and into the plant names. But she said, at that level, there's only going to be so many people that are going to get the bug to want to learn all the plants and everything. But food, everybody eats food. You take those plants and put them in food and make food with it, and then you're building something. And I'd been doing quite a bit of it on my own anyway. But it wasn't until after the book came out that I got, really whole hog into it and doing a lot of experimentation. Where before I was just doing the stuff I knew about and not trying to, improvise and stuff like that. But I had a reason to. I wanted to come up with good recipes to put in the book. And
when you're talking about social media, and I think like in the context of this interview being about folk arts, which has generally been one person passing on information to another. I guess I'm not sure how I should word this question, but is it good that people can get information from social media in this way, or do you still think that like person to person or guide to person is a better option?
Well, of course, the person to person is always a better option. The Facebook can meet the masses and really introduce huge amounts of people to this new concept, but it also invites mayhem and danger and stuff, because you get, these kids that have never done anything with any of this in their life. They've never cracked a book. They don't have any interest, but they see their friend that went out and picked a bunch of green stuff and made stuff. Oh, I want to forage, and they just go out and grab armloads of whatever it is they think might be. Is this good? They'll post on there, can I eat this? And it'd be, it might be something. I've seen multiple times people pick things that a few bites could kill you, like water hemlock. I saw water hemlock get identified as bamboo. And they just had a short segment of the stem and a few leaves, and they said, is this bamboo? And somebody said, I think it is. And then somebody else said, oh yeah, you can eat bamboo. And it's just like within a space of 2 or 3 responses, they convinced themselves that was bamboo and you could eat it. And like I said, it is the absolutely most toxic plant. 2-3 bites can kill you. It's got like an 80% fatality rate. If you get just enough to get an effect at all, it's usually fatal. And so it can be detrimental to get a lot of people that just they don't know the ethics part of it. And I'm real hard on the ethics. There's ways to do this stuff, because if it gets this popular and everybody's out yanking stuff, you're going to impact, especially with native plants. And so I really push that aspect of it.
Well, and tell me if you agree with this or not, but like to me, another value of having someone teach someone else is that connection with the land and the place, and beyond just the facts of can I eat this or not.
It is, and it's community building. It's because you're going out usually with a group, you're meeting other people with similar interests. You're outside, everybody's excited because you're learning stuff. You're learning cool stuff. Sometimes it's in a situation where you can gather stuff and take it home. A lot of times when I do private walks for groups, I'll just say, well, for a little bit extra, I'll bring a bunch of my wild vinegars, wild fruit syrups, make a wild vinaigrette dressing. I'll bring feta cheese or fruits or, berries or whatever, and make this completely gourmet salad, but all the greens are stuff that we picked on the walk. And it'll have a minimum of 15 species, and I think my record was here at the cabin at 34 species of greens in one salad.
Wow.
And I even broke that down into plant families, and there were 21 plant families, and half of them you couldn't buy a member of that entire plant family in the store anywhere. So that's the biggest thing. I do hold seminars on this. In fact, there's a little compiled couple of paragraphs on it in the back of both of my books called Wild Food versus Industrial Food. And the fact that we've bred out all of the bitter, the strong flavors, trying to make things larger and sweeter and milder, longer shelf life, more color, all the selective pressures we put on these plants and breed all that stuff out to make a big tasty crop, and then you've lost all the medicinal compounds and stuff. And so I really push that a lot.
Well, and that was another question I had, was just like, even going back to your childhood, have you seen what's available in terms of foraging change? And are you seeing fewer of certain types of plants or more of something else? Especially, I guess, part 2 of that being with the more and more that the Ozarks has become developed in, houses and things. Have you seen changes, or is it about the same?
Yeah, big time changes. And I'd just have to say the biggest change is invasive species. There's areas right down the road here that at the old Sunshine Bridge across, the old steel bridge there across James River. I've foraged there from the time I was, young, and now that is almost knee deep in euonymus winter creeper. It's an invasive vine that's one of the worst ones, and then the rest is bush honeysuckle and Bradford pear, and so that has taken a bunch out of it. The other thing is that they've gotten a lot more aggressive with spraying on the roadsides. All these little, I just go out and go into rural areas where there's a lot of farms, and the fence rows always have good pickings. When it's a pasture or a hay field, something like that, it hadn't been sprayed. Now croplands, you get out where they're actually growing soybeans, corn. I don't think I would forage much along those roadsides, but they've gotten so aggressive spraying under the power lines that it just wiped out entire, ecosystems that I was dependent on for a lot of stuff, not just, food, but my primitive skill stuff, a lot of the dog bane and several different plants that would grow along there. I'd use for cordage plants. I always knew where I could find them, and they've just gotten so aggressive with the spraying that they wiped that out. And not just the county and the state, but the individual people, are just going nuts with that stuff everywhere. So that's one of the biggest changes. As far as people's impacts on the plants, I don't think there's any. In fact, if you're doing it the right way, the plants are gonna benefit, because these plants evolved with us eating them, other animals eating them, bugs eating them. If you, and we're always after the tender young parts. So if you go to a plant and you start nipping all this green stuff off it's called the meristem, the green part that's pushing the growth out. That's what you want to eat. And if you start clipping enough off a plant, what does it do? It splits. So you're actually pushing it to make more reproductive parts. So it's going to be more productive in reseeding, however it reproduces, seeds, fruits, whatever. It's going to make a lot more of those after you've foraged a bunch on it than it would beforehand. Same with roots. If you got a place where it's illegal to dig roots on public land, first thing. But if it's on land where you got permission, when you find a big colony of something, if you get in there and have a little disturbance, the fact of the disturbance makes that plant more vigorous. It opens up spaces. A lot of times these plants are only occupying a little space because the soil biome is only in that little spot. And a lot of times that biome is produced by fungus. And every plant has a fungal associate where the fungus, the rhizome, or the threads of the mycelium goes out and connects tree roots. They suck nutrients from the tree roots, but in return they improve the soil biome, or for whatever plant it is. And so that's kind of a reciprocity thing that we talked about yesterday with on another interview. But anyway, that it just gives you a better shot at getting getting a plant that's going to last a lot longer than if you didn't forage it. There's other species out west where they find if they don't disturb it, if they don't dig the plants up out of the ground, when the seeds come, they fall on hard compacted earth and they won't regenerate. If you've gone in and dug up a bunch of plants, when the seeds fall into those dug up plot, then they'll sprout. So it's, like I said, those plants have evolved with us doing it. And if you're trying to, in fact, there's a name for it. It's called herbivory overcompensation, where the plant stimulates and pushes out all this stuff when herbivores are munching on it. But so if it's done right, it actually will benefit the plants. Now, I have seen the situation where I used to do a thing in St. Louis. It was St. Louis Slow Food, and they'd always pair a forager like me with a wild food chef. And Rob Connolly, I know you know Rob, we did one together at this thing. But at one of those, and I can't remember who it was, but it was two guys that were talking there, and one was saying, yeah, I've been looking for spice bush, and they said, all my spots in this one spot, what's his name over here, he's doing a lot of dinners, he beat me to it. And anytime that two people are competing for the same resource of a native plant, that's a problem, And it's you shouldn't market collecting when you're collecting huge amounts to feed a bunch of people. Those kind of activities, you should be concentrating on invasive and introduced plants. Very many, you want to go really light on the natives because they just we need to take care of them. They can get over harvested, but the invasive, the introduced stuff, it's always going to be there. You're never going to impact that. The more you take, the more there is. It's like,
I think the last question I have about the food, and then unless there's anything else you want to add, is going to what you referenced before with the food that you're creating yourself now with these ingredients that you foraged. Is that kind of a new thing for you? I guess question one, and then question two is, when you were sort of learning about this, were there old cookbooks and things that focused on foraged items that sort of gave you inspiration, or is this all trial and error that you've been doing yourself?
It wasn't much. And, a long time ago, there was just the stuff that I'd grown up with, and all our greens, almost all of them were with bacon grease and vinegar, salt and vinegar. So I wanted to expand out from that, but as time went on, there started to be more and more stuff about it, and like I said, a lot of mine was just experimentation. What would this taste like with this? And it wasn't until probably like I said 15, 20 years ago that there started being a lot more wild forage recipes, and and stuff you could find. I mean, everybody probably had grandma's old recipe on how she cooked the poke greens or whatever. A lot of times they just didn't write that stuff down. It was so common. It's like you writing down going to the store and buying a head of lettuce and making a salad.
Yeah. Well, that's been an interesting thing. Like when I have an interest in old cookbooks, and in my experience, it really doesn't start until the 50s for the most part.
Yeah.
And I think that oral tradition was a really big part. Or life was just different, and they didn't feel like they needed to write them down in the same way. And so, but I find that concept too, like I don't say lost information, but the information that we don't pass down in the same way anymore. And wishing we could know more about how it was back then. But the one other thing I wanted to ask you about was your connection with Marideth, especially because this year obviously was really special with both of you being recognized at the same time. And for somebody watching this who is not aware, Marideth Sisco was awarded one of these fellowships as well in 2025 for her work in storytelling and music. And I just wondered if you could kind of give us an overview of how you two met and the connections that you have.
I don't really remember exactly where I met her, but I'm sure it was through Doug Sheridan, because I roomed with him. He was the guy that I went to Winfield with, and I don't know how they knew each other, but I think they lived together, or lived close together when she was in Springfield going to school. But I played in a band with her, and Patty Van Wielden and Phil Croy, who is now with the I'm drawing a blank on their band name, but Ray Castry, and they're a long-standing band. They play kind of fusion jazz stuff. But anyway, we were playing old 30s and 40s swing at Murphy's down on Campbell Street, and that's about the only place we played. A few shows, but that's about the only place we played regularly. So that's where I met her. And when she found out that I was doing the bird stuff and going to be going to California, she said, "We are going to take pictures." And I said, "I don't have a camera." And she gave me an old Spotmatic, Pentax Spotmatic, and I think 12.5 rolls of slide film. And she said, "You fill these up and bring them home, and I'll process them." And so, and I did, and I've still got those sides.
Wow.
I got to be on Farallon Islands, and got to do some incredible stuff while I was out there. And but so that we stayed friends through all that. But she moved to West Plains to write for the Quill, and we kind of lost touch for a while. And I'd see her in passing and everything, but we weren't like playing together, weren't doing much together. And then she calls me up out of the blue and just said, actually, no, it was a message on my phone.
Oh.
I was working, this would have been 2017, I think. I was working, no, it was 2011. Oh my God. Anyway, I was working on bird study for Missouri River Bird Observatory on marsh birds, and I was out of cell phone contact. And I got this message from Marideth saying, "Hey, some little film or something is doing a filming, and they want some music. They want some musicians. You around?" And I got it 2 days after the filming, and but they did ended up getting my good buddy, who I actually roomed with for a short time. Oh God, what's his name? Jim Lansford.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and Jim and Kim got to be on in the actual film, but they were touring and couldn't stick around with after they decided they wanted to flesh out the whole soundtrack CD. So they pulled me in to do the soundtrack record. And we just thought, yeah, it's just a little movie. It's not going to do much. And then, so we did the whole thing in a day and a half. Not even 2 full days in the Nick Sibley studio. And I've done probably a dozen of those things where somebody, I want you to play for this soundtrack or this thing, or one thing or another, and we'll do it. And then I never hear anything more about it. And I thought this was going to be another one of those. And then Marideth calls me and says, well, our little film is just won all the top honors at Sundance. And then it went overseas and just was knocking down film festivals after another, and just went through all those, and came back and it started getting Oscar buzz. And so anyway, I think it got a Golden Globe nomination as well. And so for the first time in my life, I watched the Oscars to see that, because I just had no interest in all that world and stuff. So I watched it. Actually, something else that popped up was I was watching Saturday Night Live that same year, and they resurrected Wayne's World, and they did Wayne's World Oscar picks, and they did about 3 running jokes in a row about Winter's Bone. Wow! And it was like, our pick for top film is Winter's Bone. Oh, he said bone. And they made a whole series of jokes about it. But so I knew it was getting some traction then. And so to watch it, I was just flabbergasted. It got 4 category nominations. And not long after that, I guess the production company said, do you guys want to tour this music? And yeah, because we weren't even a band. We just got together, and I'd never met Van Colbert and Dennis and a few of the other people that were on that record. I knew Marideth and Teddy May, the bass player. And anyway, they just said, yeah, we'd love to do that. The first tour right out of the bat, it was 27 cities back to back. Wow. With no break. Wow. And Marideth said, we're old, you're going to kill us. So they had to redo it, and they put us, so they did a western loop, the length of that coast. Then we got a 10-day break, and then we played at the West Plains Old Time Festival during that break, and then went out and did an eastern loop. And to this day, it's just one of the most fascinating and coolest musical things I've done in my life. Get to spend all that time with those wonderful people, and so much time with Marideth. Dennis and I were the only ones that could drive that 16-passenger van, and he couldn't do cities or drive at night, so I did 3/4 of the driving. And it was long days. It wasn't just a different city a day. It was mostly a different state every day. Wow. And we'd drive for 4 or 5 hours, whatever, get to the venue, an hour sound check, maybe have an hour downtime before we play a 7 to 9 show, get back in the van, drive up until midnight, 1 o'clock, find a little motel to roost for the night, get up early and finish out the drive. Just did that for, 27 days, I think, or something like that. And a lot of the late night driving, Marideth she couldn't lay down and sleep. The rest of the band would be sacked out on the seats in the back, but she was always up in the shotgun, and we just talk. And I just love that woman. She could talk pretty much about anything. And it was just a lot of special moments through that whole thing.
Do you see yourself more as a musician or more as a naturalist person?
Yeah, music has always been in my life. But once I started doing the bird stuff, I pretty much dropped out of the music for a while. I'd come back and, like I said, get a band up for the winter, something like that. And then when I came back in 92, I started playing a lot more. And from 92 all the way up until just a few years ago, that was, I was playing usually every weekend, if not, more than that. So it's always been there, but you can't make a living just on doing that. So I've always done the classes and then done the bird research work too. I've managed to every year since '85 do some kind of a paid, contract work for a lot of it, just contract work for MDC, or I did a lot of years locally in the Ozarks when Jane she was in the, what was it called, American Bird Conservancy, before that Partners in Flight. So they had all these big guns doing really big studies. So I got to do a lot of stuff through that. And between the music, the bird work, and the classes, all three of it almost made a living. I do real good in the summertime, and then in the wintertime it's just down to music again. And so money would kind of bleed out over the winter, and I was pretty much looking forward to spring to start making money.
Yeah.
The book really kind of changed that. It really did help have another side income that just made the difference in being comfortable. So
I'm trying to think, is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to mention?
Well, that was the big three. I wanted to cover music and the bird stuff and the foraging and wilderness survival stuff. I think that was kind of the point of the thing. I did off camera. I mentioned earlier about I want your pie stuff. I want to see you involve the wild fruits and stuff in those. So that would excite me a lot.
Well, that's why I find all of this very intriguing and important, and I want to learn more too. So we will talk more.
Awesome.
So, but thank you for taking time to do this. I really appreciate it.
It was a treat.
Yeah.